preliminary results of this research that we're doing. Well, if we go back to our list of 10 questions, we can begin to answer those with this study of the 9 sites. And if we look at how old sites are and what cultures they may represent, for this study, we've identified 3 time periods that people occupied that part of the Colorado River. The late Archaic period, primarily hunter-gatherers, and possibly experimental farmers. And early farmers, probably seasonal inhabitants of that part of the river. And then later in time, we see evidence for the ancestral Pueblo people, and they were no doubt residential farmers. So those are the 3 different cultural periods. Where did people live on the landscape? This gets kind of interesting. During the late Archaic period, in that one alcove, there's 3 distinct periods of occupation or more. So that tells us that that was a suitable or favorable location for either fishing or hunting or wild plant foods. That people went back to that same location over and over again. And the alcove itself probably served as the residence for those people. And so you see, when you see fire cars and the cooking features, it tells you that people are there, not just overnight camping, but they're actually living in that rock shelter. And they were probably living there possibly year-round and possibly seasonally to take advantage of different plants or animals that may have been in harvest at that time. For the Pueblo I period, about 1,000 years ago up to 1,200 years ago, these were probably early seasonal farming people, and the settlements are scattered, and usually you find them in very small numbers. The houses are 1, 2, sometimes 3 rooms. And then we look at the different artifacts that come out of those houses, and it's fairly limited for the Pueblo I period in terms of what they may have been making on site and what they may have brought with them for that season of occupation. So these houses were built on the floodplains, and we talked a little about seasonal flooding. These houses may have been wiped out in those seasonal floods depending on when they were there. During the Pueblo II, Pueblo III period, we think these are residential farmers, and we get that from evidence of the types of artifacts that people are manufacturing right there on site. And then all of the grinding implements and the density or the number of artifacts that we find in relation to these houses. But the geomorphologists and the archaeologists are working on this idea that initially during the Pueblo II period, people built their houses pretty low down in the floodplain and fairly close to the river. And so, if you're there for several seasons and there's no flooding, you might think that it's safe, but it looks like several of those houses got flooded out at some point with some big annual floods. A little bit later in the same time period, we find the houses situated further up out of the floodplain onto higher benches. And so within 1 or 2 generations, it looks like people may have learned that building close to the floodplain, although it looks nice, it actually could be dangerous during the spring and early summer when it floods. And so they're choosing locations higher from the river to avoid that flooding. Pretty interesting learned response if you're getting to know an area. And as an archaeologist, think about, well, how did people invent or first use some technology like arrow points or spear points, or how do people figure out how to use pottery? Well, it's through this, I think, this helps explain that people learn how to adapt to different environments using different techniques. And, these people along the Colorado River may have learned something very important about how and where to build your houses using the same process. Food production and agriculture, of course, the late Archaic period, people were primarily hunting and gathering wild plant foods and small game. In that rock shelter, there was limited evidence of hunting small game, little burned bone fragments. but no evidence of agriculture. During the Pueblo I period, it was probably a combination of hunting and gathering and agriculture. And agriculture was probably seasonal, as I mentioned. And then during the Pueblo III period, there's definitely evidence that people were producing a lot of corn. And also, I mentioned the evidence for cotton too. Cotton agriculture is pretty demanding in that it takes a lot of water, a long growing season, and constant tending of those crops. And so the investment in time and labor is pretty great to live along the Colorado River for that time. Architecture, another interesting thing that we've learned. Not much in the rock shelter in terms of formal architecture, but you can think of the alcove itself as their architecture and how they use different spaces within the bench and the alcove setting. But no evidence of stone houses or any kind of formal or above ground architecture that they may have built. The Pueblo I period, no evidence of different house types or construction techniques that we found directly. But if you look at where people in the Pueblo II, Pueblo III period built, it's right on top of the same places that the earlier people were living. And so the people that occupied, areas of Unkar Delta or Furnace Flats or the Evo site may have obliterated or obscured any earlier evidence by covering up or removing or even recycling some of the building material that was already there on site for their own houses. And then we saw some photographs and examples of the types of masonry that we found in the Pueblo II period. Really nice masonry and Hough architecture. And also that the houses were extensively remodeled. So people lived in these houses, and houses take constant maintenance and rebuilding, and over time your uses of that house change, and we saw a lot of evidence that walls were moved or that bigger houses were divided into smaller spaces. And again, that tells us that people were living there for a considerable amount of time and long enough to have changing needs in how they were using their houses. And like I mentioned, just the use of driftwood in the architecture itself and how well preserved it is. And that the mortars that they were using in that masonry architecture was probably local, but they may have found a source that was higher in the clay, and we're still trying to figure out where that source may have been, or how silty river deposits may act as a fairly good binder for that kind of masonry architecture. So we're leaving the Colorado River, and I'd like to share with you work that we do with the Grand Canyon Field Institute. And that is, of course, a part of the Grand Canyon Association. And the Institute is really based on education. And so people participate in these different classes, and they're learning different aspects of park management and park science and park resources through ways of doing the work. And so these are called the hands-on resource class, and the history of the hands-on resource class in archaeology goes back almost 20 years ago. And we typically do backpacking trips and then camping trips where we're doing usually archaeological survey work. So we're walking a piece of land and identifying and discovering archaeological sites that are in that area. We have a great time. The participants love that kind of work, and not only finding evidence for